My father, the Pasha Emperor, took me by the hand one day, and I sensed in the ways my mother had taught me that he was disturbed. He led me down the hall of portraits to the ego likeness of the Duke Leto Atreides. I marked the strong resemblance between them. My father and this man in the portrait. Both with thin, elegant faces and sharp features dominated by cold eyes. Princess Dar, my father said, I would that you'd been older when it came time for this man to choose a woman. My father was 71 at the time and looking no older than the man in the portrait. Now is but 14. Yet I remember deducing that in that instant that my father secretly wished the Duke had been his son, and disliked the political necessities that made them enemies. From In My Father's House by the Princess Irulan. His first encounter with the people he had been ordered to betray left Dr. Keynes shaken. He prided himself on being a scientist to whom legends were merely interesting clues pointing toward cultural roots. Yet the boy fitted the ancient prophecy so precisely. He had the questioning eyes and the air of reserved candor. Of course, the prophecy left certain latitudes as to whether the Mother Goddess would bring the Messiah with her or produce him on the scene. Still, there was this odd correspondence between prediction and persons. They met in mid-morning outside the Harkonnen landing field administration building. An unmarked ornithopter squatted nearby, humming softly on standby like a somnolent insect. An Atreides guard stood beside it with bared sword and the faint air distortion of a shield around him. Keynes sneered at the shield pattern, thinking, Arrakis has a surprise for them here. The planetologist raised a hand, signaled for his Fremen guard to fall back. He strode on ahead toward the building's entrance, the dark hole in plastic-coated rock, so exposed that monolithic building, he thought, so much less suitable than a cave. Movement within the entrance caught his attention. He stopped, taking the moment to adjust his robe and the set of his stillsuit at the left shoulder. The entrance doors swung wide. Atreides guards emerged swiftly, all of them armed. Slow pellet stunners, swords, and shields. Behind them came a tall man, hawk-faced, dark of skin and hair. He wore a juba cloak with a Atreides crest at the breast, and wore it in a way that betrayed his unfamiliarity with the garment. It clung to the legs of his stillsuit on one side. It lacked a free swinging, straying rhythm. Beside the man walked a youth with the same dark hair, but rounder in the face. The youth seemed small for the 15 years Keynes knew him to have. But the boy carried a sense of command, a poised assurance, as though he saw and knew things all around him that were not visible to others. and he wore the same style cloak as his father, yet with casual ease that made one think the boy had always worn such clothing. The mighty will be aware of things others cannot see. Went the prophecy. Keynes shook his head, telling himself, they're just people. With the two, garbed like them for the desert, came a man Keynes recognized, Gurney Halleck. Keynes took a deep breath to still his resentment against Halleck, who had briefed him on how to behave with the Duke and the ducal heir. You may call the Duke my lord or sire. Noble one is also correct, but usually reserved for more formal occasions. The son may be addressed as young master or my lord. The Duke is a man of much leniency, but brooks little familiarity. And Keynes saw as he watched the group approach. They'll learn soon enough who's master in Arrakis. Army questioned half the night at Mentat, will they? Expect me to guide them on inspection of spice mining, do they? The import of Halleck's questions had not escaped Keynes. They wanted the Imperial bases, and it was obvious they'd learned of the bases from Idaho. I'll have Stilgar and send Idaho's head up to this Duke, Keynes told himself. The ducal party was only a few paces away now, their feet in desert boot and scrunching the sand. Keynes bowed. My Lord Duke. As he had approached the solitary figure standing near the ornithopter, Leto had studied him. Tall, thin, dressed for the desert in loose robe, stillsuit, and low boots. The man's hood was thrown back, its veil hanging to one side, revealing long sandy hair, a sparse beard. The eyes were that fathomless blue within blue under thick brows. Remains of dark stains smudged his eye sockets. You're the ecologist? Duke said. We prefer the old title here, my lord. Keynes said. Planetologist. As you wish, Duke said. He glanced down at Paul. Son, this is the judge of the change, the arbiter of dispute. The men sent here to see if the forms are obeyed in our assumption of power over this fief. He glanced at Keynes. And this is my son. My lord, Keynes said. Are you a Fremen? Paul asked. Keynes smiled. I am accepted in both siege and village, young master. But I am in His Majesty's service. The Imperial Planetologist. Paul nodded, impressed by the man's air of strength. Halleck had pointed Keynes out to Paul from an upper window of the administration building. The man standing there with the Fremen escort, the one moving now toward the ornithopter. Paul had inspected Keynes briefly with binoculars, knowing the prim, straight mouth, the high forehead, Halleck had spoken in Paul's ear. Odd sort of fellow. Has a precise way of speaking. Clipped off. No fuzzy edges. Razor-apt. And the Duke behind them had said, scientist type. Now, only a few feet from the man, Paul sensed the power in Keynes, the impact of personality, as though he were blood royal, born to command. I understand we have you to thank for our stillsuits in these cloaks, the Duke said. I hope they fit well, my lord, Keynes said. They're of Fremen make, and as near as impossible in the dimensions given by me by your man, Halleck here. I was concerned that you said you couldn't take us into the desert unless we wore these garments, Duke said. We can carry plenty of water. We don't intend to be out long, and we'll have air cover. The escort you see overhead right now, it isn't likely to be forced down. Keynes stared at him, seeing the water-fat flesh. He spoke coldly. You never talk of likelihoods on Arrakis. You speak only of possibilities. Halleck stiffened. The Duke is to be addressed as my lord or sire. Leto gave Halleck their avid hand signal to desist. Said, Our ways are new here, Gurney. We must make allowances. As you wish, sire. We are indebted to you, Dr. Keynes, Leo said. These suits and the consideration for our welfare will be remembered. On impulse, Paul called to mind the quotation from the OC Bible. Said, the gift is the blessing of the giver. The words rang out over loud in the still air. The Fremen escort Keynes had left in the shade of the administration building leaped from their swine repose. Muttering in open agitation, one cried out, Lisan al-Gaib! Keynes whirled, gave a curt chopping signal with a hand, waved the guard away. They fell back grumbling among themselves, trailed away around the building. Most interesting, Leo said. Keynes passed a hard glare over the Duke and all said, most of the desert natives here are a superstitious lot. Pay no attention to them. They mean no harm. But he thought of the words of the legend. They will greet you with holy words, and your gifts will be a blessing. Leo's assessment of Keynes, based partly on its brief verbal report, guarded and full of suspicions, suddenly crystallized. The man was Fremen. Keynes had come with a Fremen escort, which could mean simply that the Fremen were testing their new freedom to enter urban areas, but it had seemed an honor guard. And by this manner, Keynes was a proud man, accustomed to freedom, his tongue, and his manner regarded only by his own suspicions. Paul's question had been direct and pertinent. Keynes had gone native. Shouldn't we be going, sire? Halleck asked. The Duke nodded. I'll fly my own thopter. Keynes can step from me to direct me. You and Paul take the rear seats. One moment, please, Keynes said. With your permission, sire, I must check the security of your suits. The Duke started to speak, but Keynes pressed on. I have concern for my own flesh as well as yours, my lord. I am well aware of whose throat I would be slit should harm befall you two while you're in my care. The Duke frowned, thinking, how delicate this moment. If I refuse, it may offend him. And this could be a man whose value to me is beyond measure, yet to let him inside my shield, touching my person when I know so little about him. The thoughts flicked through his mind with decision hard on their heels. We're in your hands, the Duke said. He stepped forward, opening his robe, saw Halleck come on the balls of his feet, poised and alert, but remained where he was. And if you'd be so kind, the Duke said, I appreciate an explanation of the suit from one who lives so intimately with it. Certainly, Keynes said. He felt up under the robe for the shoulder seals, speaking as he examined the suit. It's basically a micro-sandwich, a high-efficiency filter and heat exchange system. He adjusted the shoulder seals. The skin contact layers porous. Perspiration passes through it, having cooled the body. Near normal evaporation process. The next two layers, Keynes tightened the chest fit, include heat exchange filaments and salt precipitators. Salts reclaimed. The Duke lifted his arms at a gesture, said, Most interesting. Breathe deeply, Keynes said. The Duke obeyed. Keynes studied the underarm seals, adjusted one. Motions of the body, especially breathing, he said, and some osmotic action provide the pumping force. He loosened the chest it slightly. Reclaimed water circulates to catch pockets from which you draw it through this tube in the clip at your neck. The Duke twisted his chin and down to look at the end of the tube. Efficient and convenient, he said. Good engineering. Keynes knelt, examined the seals. Urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads, he said, and stood up, out the neck fang. Lifted a section flat there. In the open desert, you wear this filter across your face, this tube in the nostrils, with these plugs to ensure a tight fit. Breathe in through the mouth filter, out through the nose tube. With a Fremen suit in good working order, you won't lose more than a thimbleful of moisture a day, even if you're caught in the Great Erg. Thimble a day, the Duke said. Keynes pressed a finger against the suit's forehead pad. Said, This may rub a little. If it irritates you, please tell me. I could slip patch a bit tighter. My thanks, the Duke said. He moved his shoulders in the suit as Keynes stepped back, realizing that it did feel better now. Tighter and less irritating. Keynes turned to Paul. Let me have a look at you, lad. A good man, but he'll have to learn to address us properly, the Duke thought. Paul stood passively as Keynes inspected the suit. It had been an odd sensation putting on the crinkling, slick-surfaced garment. In his foreconsciousness had been the absolute knowledge that he had never before worn a stillsuit, yet each notion of adjusting the adhesion tabs under Gary's expert guidance had seemed natural, instinctive. When he had tightened the chest to gain maximum pumping action from the motion of breathing, he had known what he did and why. When he had fitted the neck and forehead tabs tightly, he had known it was to prevent friction blisters. Keynes straightened and stepped back with a puzzled expression. "You've worn a stillsuit before?" he asked. "This is my first time." "Then someone adjusted it for you?" "No. Your desert boots are fitted slip fashion at the ankles. Who told you to do that?" "It seemed the proper way." "That most certainly is." And Keynes rubbed his cheek, thinking of the legend. "He shall know your ways, as if born to them." "We waste time," the Duke said. He gestured to the waiting thopter, led the way, accepting the guard's salute with a nod. He climbed in, fastened his safety harness, checked controls and instruments. The craft creaked as the others clambered aboard. Keynes fastened his harness, focused on the added comfort of the aircraft, soft luxury of gray-green upholstery, gleaming instruments, the sensation of filtered and washed air in his lungs as doors slammed and vent fans whirled alive. So soft, he thought. "All secure, sire," Hawk said. Leo fed power to the wings. Felt them clip and dip once, twice. They were airborne in 10 meters, wings feathered tightly and afterjets thrusting them upward in a steep, hissing climb. "Southeast over the shield wall," Keynes said. "That's where I told your Sandmaster to concentrate his equipment." "Right." The Duke banked into his air cover, the other craft taking up their guard positions as they head southeast. "The design and manufacture of these stillsuits bespeaks of a high degree of sophistication," the Duke said. "Someday I may show you a siege factory," Keynes said. "I would find that interesting," the Duke said. "I note that suits are manufactured also in some of the garrison cities." "Inferior copies," Keynes said. "Any Dune man who values his skin wears a Fremen suit." "And it'll hold your wire loss to a thimbleful a day?" "Properly suited, your forehead kept tight, all seals in order. Your major wire loss is through the palms of your hands," Keynes said. "You can wear suit gloves if you're not using your hands for clerical work. But most Fremen in the open desert rub their hands with juice from the leaves of the creosote bush. It inhibits perspiration." The Duke glanced down to the left at the broken landscape of the shield wall. Chasms of tortured rock, patches of yellow-brown crossed by black lines of fault shattering. It was as though someone had dropped this ground from space and left it where it smashed. They crossed a shallow basin with a clear outline of gray sand spray across a canyon opening to the south. The sand fingers ran out into the basin, a dry delta outlined against darker rock. Keynes sat back, thinking about the water-fat flesh he had out beneath the stillsuits. They wore shield belts over their robes, slow pellet starters at the waist, coin-sized emergency transmitters on cords around their necks. Both the Duke and his son carried knives and wrist sheaths, and the sheaths appeared well worn. The people struck Keynes as a strange combination of softness and armed strength. There was a poise to them totally unlike the Harkonnens. When you report to the Emperor on the change of government here, will you say we observed the rules? Leo asked. He glanced at Keynes, back to their course. The Harkonnens left, you came, Keynes said. And is everything as it should be? Leo asked. Momentary tension showed in the tightening of a muscle along Keynes' jaw. As planetologist and judge of the change, I am a direct subject of the Imperium, my lord. The Duke smiled grimly. But we both know the realities. I remind you that His Majesty supports my work. Indeed? And what is your work? In the brief silence, Paul thought, he's pushing this Keynes too hard. Paul glanced at Halleck, but the minstrel warrior was staring at the barren landscape. Keynes spoke stiffly. You, of course, refer to my duties as planetologist. Of course. It is mostly dryland biology and botany. Some geological work, core drilling and testing. You never really exhaust the possibilities of an entire planet. Do you also investigate the spice? Keynes turned. Paul noted the hard line of the man's cheek. A curious question, my lord. Bear in mind, Keynes, that this is now my fief. My methods differ from those of the Harkonnens. I don't care if you study the spice as long as I share what you discover. He glanced at the planetologist. The Harkonnens discouraged investigation of the spice, didn't they? Keynes stared back without answering. You may speak plainly, the Duke said, without fear for your skin. The Imperial Court is indeed a long way off, Keynes muttered, and he thought, what does this often vigor expect? Does he think me fool enough to enlist with him? The Duke chuckled, keeping his attention on their course. I detect a sour note in your voice, sir. We've waited in here with our mob of aim killers, huh? And we expect you to realize immediately that we're different from the Harkonnens? I've seen the propaganda you fled into siege and village, Keynes said. Love the good Duke, your corpse of... Here now, Halleck barked. He snapped his attention away from the window, leaned forward. Paul put a hand on Halleck's arm. Gurney, the Duke said. He glanced back. This man's been long under the Harkonnens. Hawks stepped back. Yeah. Your man how so, Keynes said. But his object explain enough. Will you open those bases to us then? The Duke asked. Keynes spoke curtly. They're His Majesty's property. They're not being used. They could be used. Does His Majesty concur? Keynes darted a hard stare at the Duke. Arrakis could be an Eden if its rulers would look up from grumbling for spice. He didn't answer my question, the Duke thought. And he said, how is the planet to become an Eden without money? What is money? Keynes asked. If it won't buy the services you need. Ah, now, the Duke thought. And he said, we'll discuss this another time. Right now, I believe we're coming to the edge of the shield wall. Do I hold the same course? Same course, Keynes muttered. Paul looked out his window. Beneath them, the broken ground began to drop away in tumbled creases toward a barren rock plain and a knife-edged shelf. Beyond the shelf, fingernail crescents of dunes marched toward the horizon, with here and there in the distance a dull smudge. A darker blotch to tell of something not sand. Rock outcroppings, perhaps. In the heat-held air, all couldn't be sure. Are there any plants down there? Paul asked. Some, Keynes said. This latitude's life zone has mostly what we call minor water stealers, adapted to raiding each other for moisture, gobbling up the trace dew. Some parts of the desert's teem with life, but all of it has learned how to survive under these rigors. If you get caught down there, you imitate that life or you die. You mean steal water from each other? Paul asked. The idea outraged him and his voice betrayed his emotion. It's done, Keynes said. But that wasn't precisely my meaning. You see, my climate demands a special attitude towards water. You are aware of water at all times. You waste nothing that contains moisture. And the Duke thought, my climate. Come around 2 degrees more southerly, my lord, Keynes said. There's a blow coming up from the west. The Duke nodded. He had seen the billowing of tan dust there. He banked the thopter around, knowing the way the escort's wings reflected milky orange from the dust-refracted light as they turned to keep pace with them. This should clear the storm's edge, Keynes said. That sand must be dangerous if you fly into it, Paul said. Will it really cut the strongest smells? At this altitude, it's not sand, but dust, Keynes said. The danger is lack of visibility, turbulence, clogged intakes. We'll see actual spice mining today? Paul asked. Very likely, Keynes said. Paul sat back. He had used the questions and hyper-awareness to do what his mother called registering the person. He had Keynes now. Tone of voice, each detail of face and gesture, an unnatural folding of the left sleeve on the man's robe told of a knife in an arm sheath. The waist bulged strangely. It was said that desert men wore a belted sash into which they tucked small necessities. Perhaps the bulges came from such a sash. Certainly not from a concealed shield belt. A copper pin engraved with the likeness of a hair clasped the neck of Keynes' robe. Another smaller pin with similar likeness hung at the corner of the hood, which was thrown back over his shoulders. Halleck twisted in the seat beside Paul, reached back into the rear compartment, and brought out his ballast. Keynes looked around as Halleck tuned the instrument, then returned his attention to their course. "What would you like to hear, young master?" Halleck asked. "You choose, Gurney," Paul said. Halleck bent his ear close to the sounding board, strummed a chord, and sang softly, "Our fathers ate manna in the desert, in the burning places where the whirlwinds came. Lord, save us from that horrible land. Save us, oh, save us from the dry and thirsty land." Keynes glanced at the Duke. "You do travel a light complement of guards, my lord." "Are all of them such men of many talents, Gurney?" The Duke chuckled. "Gurney's one of a kind. I like him with me for his eyes." "His eyes miss very little." The planetologist frowned. Without missing a beat in his tune, Halleck interposed, "For I am like an owl of the desert, oh, I am like an owl of the desert." The Duke reached down, brought up a microphone from the instrument panel, thumbed it to life, said, "Leader to escort Gemma. Flying object at 9 o'clock, Sector B. Do you identify it?" "It's merely a bird," Keynes said, and added, "You have sharp eyes." Panel speaker crackled, then, "Escort Gemma. Object examined under full amplification. It's a large bird." Paul looked in the indicated direction, saw the distant speck, a dot of intermittent motion, and realized how keyed up his father must be. Every sense was at full alert. "I'd not realized there were birds that large as far into the desert," Duke said. "That's likely an eagle," Keynes said. "Many creatures have adapted to this place." The ornithopter swept over a bare rock plain. Paul looked down from their 2,000 meters altitude, saw the wrinkled shadow of their craft and escort. The land beneath seemed flat, but shadow wrinkles said otherwise. "Has anyone ever walked out of the desert?" Duke asked. Halleck's music stopped. He leaned forward to catch the answer. Not from the deep desert, Keynes said. Men have walked out of the second zone several times. They've survived by crossing the rock areas where worms seldom go. The timbre of Keynes' voice held Paul's attention. He felt his senses come alert the way they were trained to. The worms, the Duke said. I must see one sometime. You may see one today, Keynes said. Wherever there is spice, there are worms. Always? Halleck asked. Always. Is there a relationship between the worm and the spice? The Duke asked. Keynes turned and Paul saw the pursed lips as the man spoke. They defend the spice sands. Each worm has a territory. As to the spice, who knows? Worm specimens we examined let us suspect complicated chemical interchanges within them. We find traces of hydrochloric acid in the ducts. More complicated acid forms elsewhere. I'll give you my monograph on the subject. And shields no defense? The Duke asked. Shields? Keynes sneered. Activate a shield within the worm zone and you seal your fate. Worms ignore territory lines. I'm from far around to attack a shield. No man wearing a shield has ever survived such attack. How are worms taken then? High voltage electrical shock applied separately to each ring segment is the only known way of killing and preserving an entire worm, Keynes said. They can be stunned and shattered by explosives, but each ring segment has a life of its own. Barring atomics, I know of no explosive powerful enough to destroy a large worm entirely. They're incredibly tough. Why hasn't an effort been made to wipe them out? Paul asked. Too expensive, Keynes said. Too much area to cover. Paul leaned back in his corner. His truth sense, awareness of tone's shadings, told him that Keynes was lying and telling half-truths, and he thought, if there is a relationship between spice and worms, killing the worms would destroy the spice. No one will have to walk out of the desert soon, the Duke said. Trip these little transmitters at our necks, and rescues on the way. All our workers will be wearing them before long. We're setting up a special rescue service. Very commendable, Keynes said. Your tone says you don't agree, the Duke said. Agree? Of course I agree. But it won't be much use. Static electricity from sandworms masks out many signals. Transmitters short out. They've been tried here before, you know. Arrakis is tough on equipment. And if a worm's hunting you there's not much time. Frequently, you have no more than 15 or 20 minutes. What would you advise? The Duke asked. You asked my advice? As a planetologist, yes. You'd follow my advice? If I found it sensible. Very well, my lord. Never travel alone. The Duke turned his attention from the controls. That's all? That's all. Never travel alone. Well, if you're separated by a storm and forced down, Halleck asked, isn't there anything you could do? Anything covers much territory, Keynes said. What would you do? Paul asked. Keynes turned a hard stare at the boy, brought his attention back to the Duke. I'd remember to protect the integrity of my stillsuit. If I were outside the worm zone or in rock, I'd stay with the ship. If I were down in open sand, I'd get away from the ship as fast as I could. About 1,000 meters would be far enough. Then I'd hide beneath my robe. A worm would get the ship, but it might miss me. Then what? Halleck asked. Keynes shrugged. Wait for the worm to leave. That's all? Paul asked. When the worm is gone, one may try to walk out, Keynes said. You must walk softly. Avoid drum stands. Tidal dust basins. Head for the nearest rock zone. There are many such zones. You might make it. Drum sand? Halleck asked. A condition of sand compaction, Keynes said. The slightest step sets drumming. Worms always come to that. And a tidal dust basin? The Duke asked. Certain depressions in the desert have filled with dust over the centuries. Some are so vast they have currents and tides. All will swallow the unwary who step into them. Halleck sat back, resumed strumming the baliset. Presently he sang, Wild beasts of the desert do hunt there, waiting for the innocents to pass, so tempt not the gods of the desert. Lest you seek a lonely epitaph, the perils of the... He broke off, leaned forward. Dust cloud ahead, sir. I see it, Kearney. That's what we seek, Keynes said. Paul stretched up in the seat to peer ahead. Saw a rolling yellow cloud low on the desert surface, some 30 kilometers ahead. One of your factory crawlers, Keynes said. It's on the surface, and that means means it's on spice. The cause and its sand being expelled after the spice has been centrifugally removed. There's no other cloud quite like it. Aircraft over it, Duke said. I see 2, 3, 4 spotters, Keynes said. They're watching for worm sign. Worm sign? Duke asked. A sand wave moving toward the crawler. They'll have seismic probes on the surface, too. Worms sometimes travel too deep for the wave to show. Keynes swung his gaze around the sky. Should be a carryall wing around, but I don't see it. The worm always comes, eh? Always. Paul leaned forward, touched Keynes' shoulder. How big an area does each worm stake out? Keynes frowned. The child kept asking adult questions. That depends on the size of the worm. What's the variation? Big ones may control 300 or 400 square kilometers. Small ones, he broke off as the Duke kicked up on the jet brakes. The ship bucked as its tail pods whispered sounds. Stub wings elongated, cupped the air. The craft became a full thopter as the Duke banked it, holding the wings to a gentle beat. pointing with his left hand off to the east beyond the factory crawler. Is that Wormsign? Keynes leaned across the Duke to peer out into the distance. Paul and Halleck ran together, looking in the same direction. Paul noted that their escort, caught by the sudden maneuver, had surged ahead, but now was curving back. The factory crawler lay ahead of them, still some 3 kilometers away. Where the Duke had pointed, crescent dune tracks spread shallow ripples toward the horizon, and, rushing through them as a level line stretching into the distance, came an elongated mound in motion, a cresting of sand. It reminded Paul of the way a big fish disturbed the water when swimming just under the surface. Worm, Keynes said. Big one. He leaned back, grabbed the microphone from the panel, punched out a new frequency selection, glanced at the grid chart on rollers over their heads. He spoke into the microphone. Calling crawler at Delta Ajax 9er. Wormsign warning, crawler at Delta Ajax 9er. Wormsign warning, acknowledge please. He waited. The panel speaker emitted stacked crackles and a voice. Who calls Delta Ajax 9er? Over. They seem pretty calm about it, Halleck said. Keynes spoke into the microphone. Unlisted flight north and east of you, about 3 kilometers. Wormsign is on intercept course. Your position, estimated contact, 25 minutes. Another voice rumbled from the speaker. This is Spire Control, sign confirmed. Stand by for contact fix. There was a pause, then, contact in 26 minutes minus. That was a sharp estimate. Who's on the enlisted flight? Over. Halleck had his harness off and surged forward between Keynes and the Duke. Is this regular working frequency, Keynes? Yes, why? Who be listening? Just the work crews in this area. Cuts down interference. Again, the speaker crackled, then, there's Delta Ajax 9er. Who gets bonus credit for that spot? Over. Halleck glanced at the Duke. Keynes said, there's bonus based on spice load for whoever gives first worm warning. They want to know. Tell them who had first sight of that worm. Halleck said. Duke nodded. Keynes hesitated, lifted the microphone. Spire credit to the Duke Leo Trays. The Duke Leo Trays. Over. The voice from the speaker was flat and partly distorted by a burst of static. We read, and thank you. Now tell them to divide the bonus among themselves. Halleck ordered. Tell them it's the Duke's wish. Keynes took a deep breath, then, it's the Duke's wish that you divide the bonus among your crew. Do you read? Over. Acknowledge and thank you, the speaker said. The Duke said, I forgot to mention that Gurney is also very talented in public relations. Keynes turned a puzzled frown on Halleck. This lets them know the Duke is concerned for their safety, Halleck said. Word will get around. It was on an area working frequency. Not likely Harkonnen agents heard. He glanced out at their air cover. And with a pretty strong force, it was a good risk. The Duke banked their craft toward the sand cloud erupting from the factory crawler. What happens now? There's a Carryall wing somewhere close, Keynes said. You'll come in and lift off the crawler. What if the Carryall's wrecked? Hawk asked. Some equipment is lost, Keynes said. Getting close over the crawler, my lord. You'll find this interesting. Luke scowled, busied himself with the controls as they came into turbulent air over the crawler. Paul looked down, saw the and still spewing out of the metal and plastic monster beneath them. It looked like a great tan and blue beetle, with many wide tracks extending on arms around it. He saw a giant inverted funnel snout poked in dark sand in front of it. Rich spice bed by the color, Keynes said. They'll continue working until the last minute. The Duke fed more power to the wings, stiffened them for a deeper descent as he settled lower in a circling glide above the crawler. A glance left and right showed his tower holding altitude and circling overhead. Paul studied the yellow cloud launching from the crawler's pipe vents. Looked out over the desert at the approaching worm track. Shouldn't we be hearing them call in the Carryall? Hawk asked. They usually have the wing on a different frequency, Keynes said. Shouldn't they have 2 Carryalls standing by for every crawler? The Duke asked. There should be 26 men on that machine down there, not to mention cost of equipment. Keynes said, You don't have enough He broke off as the speaker erupted with an angry voice. Any of you see the wing? He isn't answering. A garble of noise crackled from the speaker, drowned in an abrupt override signal, then silence, and the first voice. Report on the numbers. Over. This is Spire Control. Last I saw, the wing was pretty high and circling off northwest. I don't see him now. Over. Spire 1, negative. Over. Spire 2, negative. Over. Spire 3, negative. Over. Silence. The Duke looked down. His own craft's shadow was just passing over the crawler. Only 4 spires, is that right? Correct. There are 5 in our party, the Duke said. Our ships are larger. We can crowd in 3 each. Their spars ought to be able to lift off 2 each. Paul did the mental arithmetic, said, That's 3 short. Why don't they have 2 Carryalls to each crawler? Barked the Duke. You don't have enough extra equipment, Keynes said. All the more reason we should protect what we have. Where could that Carryall go? Hogg asked. Could have been forced down somewhere out of sight, Keynes said. The Duke grabbed the microphone, hesitated with thumb poised over its switch. How could they lose sight of a Carryall? They keep their attention on the ground looking for worm signs, Keynes said. The Duke thumbed the switch, spoke into the microphone. That is your Duke. We're coming down to take off Delta Ajax Myers' crew. All spars are ordered to comply. Spars will land on the east side. We will take the west. Over. He reached down, punched out his own command frequency. Repeated the order for his own air cover. Handed the microphone back to Keynes. Keynes returned to working the frequency, and a voice blasted from the speaker. Almost a full load of spice. We have almost a full load. We can't leave that for a damned worm. Over. Damn the spice! The Duke barked. He grabbed back the microphone, said, We can always get more spice. There are seats in our ships for all but 3 of you. Draw straws or decide any way you'd like to who's to go, but you're going, and that's an order. He slammed the microphone back into Keynes' hand, muttered, Sorry, as Keynes shook an injured finger. How much time? 9 minutes. Keynes said. Duke said, This ship is more power than the others. If we took off under jet with 3 or wings, we could ground an additional man. That sounds soft, Keynes said. With 4 extra men aboard on a jet takeoff, we could snap up the wings, sire. Hogg said, Not on this ship, Duke said. He hauled back on the controls as the Thopter glided in beside the crawler. The wings tipped up, braked the Thopter to a skidding stop within 20 meters of the factory. The crawler was silent now, no sand spouting from its vents. Only a faint mechanical rumble issued from it, becoming more audible as the Duke opened his door. Immediately, their nostrils were assailed by the odor of cinnamon, heavy and pungent. With a loud flapping, the spar aircraft glided down to the sand on the other side of the crawler. The Duke's own escort swooped into land in line with him. Paul, looking out at the factory, saw how all the Thopters were dwarfed by it, gnats beside a warrior beetle. Gurney, you and Paul toss out that rear seat, the Duke said. He manually cranked the wings out to 3/4, set their angle, checked the jet pod controls. Why the devil aren't they coming out of that machine? They're hoping the Carryall will show up, Keynes said. They still have a few minutes. He glanced off to the east. All turned to look the same direction, seeing no sign of the worm, but there was a heavy charged feeling of anxiety in the air. The Duke took the microphone, punched for his command frequency, said, 2 of you toss out your shield generators. By the numbers. You can carry 1 more than man that way. We're not leaving any men for that monster. He keyed back to the working frequency, barked, All right, you and Delta Jax 9er, out, now! This is a command from your Duke. On the double, or I cut the crawler apart with a laser gun. A hatch snapped open near the front of the factory. Another at the rear, another at the top. Men came tumbling out, sliding and scrambling down to the sand. A tall man in patched working robe was the last to emerge. He jumped down to a track and then to the sand. The Duke hung the microphone up on the panel, swung out onto the wing step, shouted, 2 men each into your spotters! The man in the patched robe began pulling off pairs of his crew, pushing them toward the craft waiting on the other side. 4 over here, the Duke shouted. 4 into that ship back there. He jabbed a finger at an escort thopter directly behind him. The guards were just wrestling the shield generator out of it. And 4 into that ship over there. He pointed to the other escort that had shed its shield generator. 3 each into the others. Run, you sand dogs! The tall man finished counting off his crew, came slogging across the sand, followed by 3 of his companions. I hear the worm, but I can't see it, Keynes said. The others heard it then, an abrasive slithering, distant and growling louder. Damn sloppy way to operate, the Duke muttered. Aircraft began flapping off the sand around them. It reminded the Duke of a time in his home planet's jungles. A sudden emergence into a clearing, and carrion birds lifting away from the carcass of a wild ox. The spice workers slogged up to the side of the thopter, started climbing behind the Duke. Halleck helped, dragging them into the rear. In you go, boys, he snapped. On the double! Paul cried into a corner by the swaying men, smelled the perspiration of fear, saw that 2 of the men had wore neck adjustments on their stillsuits. He followed the information in his memory for future action. His father would have to order tight stillsuit discipline. Men tended to become sloppy if you didn't watch such things. The last man, Kate, gasping into the rear, said, The worm! It's almost on us! Blast off! Duke slid to a seat, frowning, said, We still have almost 3 minutes on the original contact estimate. Is that right, Keynes? He shut his door, checked it. Almost exactly, my lord, Keynes said, and he thought, a cool one, this Duke. All secure here, sire, Halleck said. The Duke nodded, watched the last of his escort take off. He adjusted the igniter, glanced once more at wings and instruments, punched the jet sequence. The takeoff pressed the Duke and Keynes deep into their seats, compressed the people in the rear. Keynes watched the way the Duke handled the controls, gently, securely. The thopter was fully airborne now, and the Duke studied his instruments, glanced left and right at his wings. She's very heavy, sir, Halleck said. Well within the tolerances of this ship, the Duke said. You didn't really think I'd risk this cargo, did you, Gurney? Halleck grinned and said, Not a bit of it, sire. The Duke banked his craft in a long, easy curve, climbing over the crawler. Paul crushed into a corner beside the window, stared down at the silent machine on the sand. The worm sign had broken off about 400 meters from the crawler, and now there appeared to be turbulence in the stand around the factory. The worm is now beneath the crawler. Keynes said, "You're about to witness a thing few have seen." Flecks of dust shot out of the sand around the crawler now. The big machine began to tip down to the right. A gigantic sand whirlpool began forming there to the right of the crawler. It moved faster and faster. Sand and dust filled the air now for hundreds of meters around. Then they saw it. A wide hole emerged from the sand. Sunlight flashed from glistening white spokes within it. The hole's diameter was at least twice the length of the crawler, all estimated. He watched as the machine slid into the opening in a billow of dust and sand. The hole pulled back. "Gods, what a monster!" muttered a man beside Paul. "Got all our flogging spice!" groaned another. "Someone is going to pay for this," the Duke said. "I promise you that." By the very flatness of his father's voice, Paul sensed the deep anger. He found that he shared it. This was criminal waste. In the silence that followed, they heard Keynes. "Bless the Maker and his water," Keynes murmured. "Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people." "What's that you're saying?" Duke asked, but Keynes remained silent. Paul glanced at the men crowded around him. They were staring fearfully at the back of Keynes' head. One of them whispered, "Liet." Keynes turned, scowling. The man sat back, abashed. Another rescued man began coughing, dry and rasping. Presently he gasped, "Curse this hellhole." The tall man who had come last out of the crawler said, "Be you still, Coss? You but worsen your cough." He stirred among the men until he could look through them at the back of the Duke's head. "You be the Duke Leo, I warrant," he said. "It is to you we give thanks for our lives. We were ready to end it there until you came along." "Quiet, man. Let the Duke fly his ship," Hawk muttered. Paul glanced at Hawk. He too had seen the tension wrinkles at the corner of his father's jaw. One walked softly when the Duke was in a rage. Leo began easing his thopter out of his great banking circle, stopped at a new sign of movement on the sand. The worm had withdrawn into the depths, and now, near where the crawler had been, two figures could be seen moving north away from the sand depression. They appeared to glide over the surface with hardly a lifting of dust to mark their passage. "Who's that down there?" The Duke barked. "Two Johnnies who came along for the ride, sir," said the tall man. "Why wasn't something said about them?" "It was a chance they took, sir," the Dune man said. "My lord," said Keynes, "these men know us of little use to do anything about men trapped on the desert in Worm Country. We'll send a ship from base for them, Duke snapped. As you wish, my lord, Keynes said. But likely, when the ship gets here, there'll be no one for us. There'll be no one to rescue. We'll send a ship anyway, Duke said. They were right beside where the worm came up, Paul said. How'd they escape? The sides of the hole cave in and make the distance deceptive, Keynes said. You waste fuel here, sire, Hogg ventured. I agree. The Duke brought his craft around toward the shield wall. His escort came down from struggling stations, took up positions above and on both sides. Paul thought about what the Dune man and Keynes had said. He sensed half-truths, outright lies. The men on the sand glided across the surface so surely, moving in a way obviously calculated to keep from luring the worm back out of its depths. Fremen, Paul thought. Who else would be so sure on the sand? Who else might be left out of your worries as a matter of course? Because they're in no danger? They know how to live here. They know how to outwit the worm. What were the Fremen doing on that crawler? Paul asked. Keynes whirled. The tall Dune man turned wide eyes on Paul. Blue within blue. Within blue. Who be this lad? He asked. Halleck moved to place himself between the man and Paul. Said, that is Paul Atreides, Duke of Lair. Why says he there are a Fremen on our tumbler? On our rumbler? The man asked. They fit the description, Paul said. Keynes snorted. You can't tell Fremen just by looking at them. He looked at the Dune man. You. Who were those men? Friends of ours, the Dune man said. Just friends from a village who wanted to see the spice sands. Keynes turned away. Fremen. But he was remembering the words of the legend. The Lisan al-Gaib shall see through all subterfuge. They'd be dead now, most likely, young sir, the Dune man said. We should not speak unkindly on them. But Paul heard the falsehood in their voices, felt the menace had brought Hogg instinctively into guarding position. Paul spoke dryly. A terrible place for them to die. Without turning, Keynes said, when God hath ordained a creature to die in a particular place, he causeth that creature's wants to direct him to that place. Leo turned a hard stare at Keynes, and Keynes, returning the stare, found himself troubled by the fact he had observed here. This Duke was concerned more over the men than he was over the spice. He risked his own life and that of his son to save the men. He passed off the loss of a spice crawler with a gesture. The threat to men's lives had him in a rage. A leader such as that would command fanatic loyalty. He would be difficult to defeat. Against his own will and all previous judgments, Keynes admitted to himself, I like this Duke.